How the slave trade affected African society. The bondage of African people who were forced into labor did not begin when they were kidnapped by the Caucasian people and taken to the United States of America. Quote, since the 16th century, the Spanish and Portuguese have been using the African people as avenues of labor, end quote. Nevertheless, the Atlantic slave trade was like no other. Quote, it has been estimated that over 12 million Africans were forcibly removed from Africa and transported across the Atlantic to the Caribbean islands and the American continent, end quote. The impact and turmoil of the Atlantic slave trade drastically transformed the African societies. As a result of the negative effect of the slave trade of the African society, it has brought a long-term impoverishment of West Africa. The millions of able-bodied Africans that were captured caused an increase of deaths, economics, and ruination of the environment resulting from wars and slave raids. Those who were unable to perform labor, the captors from the military left the old and the very young vulnerable or killed them. The journey to the transportation location of the forced captives was extremely grueling, which caused lost lives. The plan of the captors was to keep the majority of the enslaved to remain in Africa. However, many were transported across the continent of Sahara to the north. The slave trade caused the population of Africa to remain at a plateau until the centuries after the end of the 19th century. In addition to the demographic toll, the slave trade and the Africans' ability to rise above it produced new dynamics of social and political changes. Social relations between the population were reprogrammed and traditional values were resurfaced. Besides the demographic toll of the slave trade and the Africans' resistance to it led to profound social political changes. The slave trade caused the Africans to develop predatory regime and the economic stagnation. Many of the African communities relocated to the area from the route of slave traders even after kidnapping was over. The development of creating a utopian society was hindered as they dedicated all their energy to hiding and defending themselves. Quote, the slave trade caused great disruption in the continent. The relationships between kingdoms, ethnic groups, religious communities, caste rulers, subjects, peasants, and soldiers, and the enslaved and the free were immensely transformed, end quote. In some of the African societies, people developed a new style of leadership to create more immutable structures of government to ensure the protection of the people. Unfortunately, the European power interfered in the process of recreating a government to oppress African people and to prevent them from development. Concludingly, the influence of the slave trade left the continent underdeveloped, disorganized, and vulnerable. Because of this, Europeans moved to the next phase of the oppress those left in the continent, colonialism. Between the 1870s and 90s, Africans faced European imperialism, aggression, diplomatic pressures, military evasion, and eventual conquest and colonizations, end quote. Although the European people created various forms of oppression, the African resilience created resistance against their attempt to colonize African countries. At last, the Europeans gained most of the power. Much of Africa has been colonized by European powers. The cause of the European imperialism to transition into Africa was formed by the impulse of Africa's most vulnerable areas after the slave trade, economic, political, and social. They came into power after the disintegration of profitable slave trade that caused an expansion of European capitalist industry revolution. Quote, the significance of capitalist industrializations, including the demand for sources of raw material, the search for guaranteed markets and profitable investments outlets spurred European scramble in the partition and eventual conquest of Africa. End quote. Europeans had different avenues that they wanted to use to overthrow the African power. However, the primary reason was economics. Quote, European ledgers revealed the many things traded in exchange for people, including cloth, hard cash, iron bars, guns, gunpowder, textiles, pottery, glassware, beads, ironmongery, horses, and brandy. End quote. Cowries is fine structure of oval-shaped shells of different sizes with serrated edges was the optimum exchange imported by the British. They became the top system to exchange between Europeans and African traders. Captures paid thousands of oil-shaped shells for the enslaved Africans. Another material exchange was the mass introduction of firearm. It was an innovation brought by the Europeans to Africa. People of high ranking would trade with Europeans to have access to guns. Millions of guns were transported to Africa across the Indian 18th century. Due to the mental implications that the slave trade had on the African people and leaders, the rulers exchanged slaves for firearms. The phenomenon created a great division in Africa. Rulers would acquire guns to have the advantage of their rivals, which unfortunately motivated their drive to capture and sell slaves. In the beginning, before captivity began, Europeans were not able to independently enter into Africa, to force the people into ships to be transported to the Americas. With the assistance of African rulers, some who were relying on false promise from the Europeans or other rulers who wanted to acquire more of an advantage, brought enslaved Africans from various areas of the coast of Africa. Those African traders and rulers who used enslaved people as an exchange had those people for political conflict, but some converts for wages. Multiple scholars of African history and the African diaspora provide explanations for why African traders gave away in large supply of their own people to the Europeans for the transatlantic slave trade. Quote, before Europeans came into the outskirts of Africa, slavery already played a major role in Western and Central African societies and contributed in the maritime slave trade systems across the Indian Ocean and Mediterranean Sea. End quote. Contrary, some historians argue that Europeans took advantage to use the pre-existing slave trade system in Africa to gain the favor of African traders to acquire slaves for labor in the plantation in Americas. During the development and the plan by the Europeans, the areas of Africa consisted of multiple political and social structures ranging from different sizes of communities. The groups often had great conflict over political growth and expansion of economics. Quote, African ethnic identities were influential. They did not see each other as black or as an African. They looked at it, cultural ethnic influence in individual. End quote. Due to the conflict between ethnic groups, produced slaves to be placed in it. Slave trade, then the transatlantic trade. Europeans made great promise to African traders to create commerce among them to provide enslaved Africans for the slave trade. Quote, European traders encouraged African consumers' demands for European goods for military alliance to integrate fighting and increased the numbers of captives and shifted the location of points for the trade along the west and central African coast to follow African military conflicts, end quote. In different parts of Africa where slavery was not common activity, European demand was more forced to the presence of the area and trade. Europeans brought with them from the country of Africa different materials to trade to influence African rulers around the continent. They made brass, which was brass molded into bracelet shape into material became the money supply in West Africa. The brassware was often sold to slave traders for the supply of enslaved Africans in the market. Quote, the main supplier for were the city of Venice in Italy in Bohemia, known as sorry, I can't pronounce that. Sihosvika. Occasionally, end quote, occasionally the supply of material that the Europeans, and by the change of appearance, could cause them to be out of a deal with the African slave traders. Quote, the Bristol ship, the Africa in 1774, was left with a large quantity of unsold beads, end quote. The constant demand for European consumers' interest in African slavery was great, which caused the social instability that followed political conflict and inevitably challenged the resources amongst the various African groups. Many African traders turned to the transatlantic slave trade to destroy the governments of other African groups to rank the profits. The separation and suffering of Africans were universally devastating of the slave trade. The bondage of people are the threatening people put the great fight in resisting dehumanization the Europeans and African traders were putting them through. Various villages throughout Africa created warning signals to alarm citizens to prevent attacks from traders. If an individual or a group of people were captured and forced into ships for the Middle Passage, enslaved Africans resisted by organizing hunger strikes, forming rebellion, and even committed suicide by leaping overboard rather than living in slavery, end quote. The act of rebellion was affecting the Europeans, which caused them to avoid certain locations of Africa that the plan was in place. This fortunately resulted in less Africans being captured and forced into the transatlantic slave trade. Quote, bury me in the ocean with my ancestors that jumped from the ships because they knew death was better than bondage. Thank you, end quote.